reason. Oh, is it supposed to snow again on Wednesday? Okay. So yeah, so the goal is then to get the data analyzed so that you can write a lab report. Yay, write another lab report. And then what we're going to do from here on out after that's done is we're going to do this project in lab that involves making clay models of caterpillars. And here in the Midwest, we get monarch butterfly caterpillars being hatched out. They feed on milkweeds, and then as they feed on milkweeds, they absorb the toxic chemicals that are in milkweeds. There are these things called cardiac glycosides that milkweeds produce. They essentially stop heart activity in vertebrates. And when a bird eats one of those, generally throws up, has a very negative physiological reaction to the taste of it. And of course, that's an evolved response because if you consume it and keep it in your body, it will kill you. And so, in the same way that we reject bitter things because a lot of times the things that we perceive as bitter are toxic to us, birds respond in a similar way to monarch caterpillars. So, we're going to read a paper by Butch Brody about coral snake mimicry, and he used clay models of different snake patterns to investigate aposematic coloration in coral snakes. And we had an evolution ecology group 4 years ago, that decided to investigate this in, maybe it was 3 years ago. Yeah, Rose and Kiara. As in when you were a freshman. Yeah, they made models of caterpillars and put them out in the field. And so we're going to replicate that study. Because that worked. We've done the snake thing before, but because we're so far outside of the range of coral snakes, it doesn't really work very well. And yeah, so we used the caterpillars, and the caterpillars worked really, really well. And so we'll reproduce that. A lot of their models got pretty beat up in the field, so we'll remake models so that we have enough sample size. Then we'll put them out in the field, we'll see who attacks them, and then we'll bring them back into the lab and score those attacks and see if birds are capable of, if birds actually do avoid caterpillars on the basis of color pattern alone. Because in theory, if you attack a caterpillar model, you don't know that it's a clay model until you actually bite into it. And the nice thing about using clay models is the clay model doesn't have any of the noxious properties of the monarch caterpillar to begin with. So we'll be looking for differences in how frequently the caterpillar that is just solid green and models a tasty caterpillar, how those attack rates differ from attack rates on the monarch color pattern. But it takes some time to make those clay models, especially the monarch, because you have to layer layers of clay on top of one another that are different colors, because these are banded caterpillars. Then you stack them on top of one another, and then you cut them out, and then when you roll them out, the bands spread out a little bit, and they look like little multicolored caterpillars. So anyway, that's what we'll do. And depending on how long it takes us to make models, my goal would be to try and get models out into the field before spring break. But if we don't make that deadline, we can get them out after spring break and we'll still be fine. Because it doesn't really take that long for them to be in the field. But what we might want to do is deploy them once, then pick them up and score them, and then fix them, and then deploy them again so that we have a higher sample size. But we'll just kind of see how time is going in the semester. During those weeks when we're working on the clay caterpillars, the clay gets on your hands, so we'll put stuff down on the countertops. I have little strips of wood that you can roll the clay out with so that it's all the same thickness. Then you stack the different colors up, and then you roll those there, and then you cut them, and then you stack them on top of one another again. Then you roll that so that they're all fused together.
Does it look like candy? you seen like candy where you stack the colors together?
And
then they like.
Very possibly, yeah, sure. So anyway, it does take a little bit of time, and it is kind of messy. We'll put stuff down on the lab tables. You'll wear gloves and stuff like that because I find that modeling clay is sometimes hard to get off of my hands. But anyway, once we get them made, we'll put them out in the field and see what happens to them. Yeah.
I was also playing some of our facilitators for literature discussions, and for my week between 8th and February.
Yeah.
There's 2 papers there.
Yes.
But we're only writing about 1.
Yes. But we're going to discuss both.
Okay. I'm still the facilitator for both.
You are still the facilitator for both. They're related to one another.
I figured, yeah.
So, yeah, they go kind of together. The first paper that you're going to write on, you've already written a literature summary. You actually wrote a literature summary on that paper. Wait, is that right?
The Brody author sounds familiar. I thought it might have been in the 80s.
It was in the 80s, so this is a different paper, but it's on the same. Oh no, this is the coral snake paper. Yeah, it is the coral snake paper.
It is.
Yeah, it is the coral snake paper. Different, same author, different topic. So you haven't written a literature summary over this topic before. But that evolution paper is really pretty short and pretty easy to understand. So, yeah. The other one is more involved because it involves, if I'm recalling correctly, yeah, it's a little more involved because of what they were doing. They were doing the same experiment in a different environment that had a different suite of species that were present, and so they're very closely related. So write a literature summary over the Brody paper, but then we'll discuss both of them kind of simultaneously. So if you want to talk to me about what your approach is going to be for that week, you might want to take a different strategy than some of the others, because what you might want to do is introduce the Brody paper in a relatively quick and succinct way, introduce the Jansen paper in a relatively quick and succinct way, so that you can then kind of start putting what the 2 of those papers together say about this topic. So you might want to take a different strategy than maybe what Avery is going to do next week. All right. We were talking about condition-dependent decisions, and we were talking in particular about this example from your book, where, ignore the stuff about the sausages up top. What's really important is the stuff down below, is if your risk of survival, your chance of survival rather, is related to your energy supply that you have at the end of the day. Because if you have enough energy to make it through the night, you live to feed another day. If you don't have enough energy to make it through the night, then you die of lack of energy during the night. And you need 8. When you get to 8 units of energy, you survive. If you're anything below 8, you die. If there are 2 different environments, environment 1 and environment 2, environment 1 provides 1 unit of energy with a probability of 1, which means you're going to get 1 unit of energy, period. On the other hand, environment 2 provides 2 units, but the 2 units are with a probability of 1/2, and the other half of the time you get 0 units. And so the question of where to feed, do you want to feed in habitat 1 or do you want to feed in habitat 2, might actually depend on what your energy state is, what your condition is. If your condition is 6, if you forage in environment 1, you're guaranteed to get some food, but that's still not enough food to make it to the next day. So it behooves you to take a chance on environment 2, where you might get 2 units, which will get you to what you need to make it through to the next day, or you might get nothing, so you stay at 6 units, but that gives you a 50% chance of survival, whereas even though this constant environment here provides a constant supply of food, it doesn't provide you enough food. And so in this case, if you're at this state, your choice of where to forage is there. And so this would be seen as taking a risk, because you're taking a risk because you're risking not getting anything. But the payoff, if you do get something, is that you get enough energy to survive. And so we have these terms, and they'll come up in a few minutes. I'll introduce them now. We sometimes refer to organisms as risk-prone or risk-averse. And oftentimes these are referring to the tendency of organisms to, in some cases, place themselves at higher risk of predation if you're risk-prone versus risk-averse. So you might be risk-prone if you tend to forage in areas where there's a high rate of predation, risk-averse if you only forage in safe places. You might also be viewed as risk-prone if you tend to forage in variable places rather than constant environments, variable habitats rather than constant environments. This is risk-averse, the first environment, because you get a very predictable supply of food. That predictable supply of food is lower than the variable environment, but the thing about it is that it's constant, as opposed to a more risk-prone approach goes to an environment that is more variable. It may in the end provide more of a payoff to you, but it is more variable. If your state is at 7 and you're trying to get to 8, you should go to the first environment, because all you need is 1 unit of energy and you know you're going to get it there. You could get more energy by going to the second environment and foraging, and if you score food, you would be at 9 units of energy, and that would be great. You would actually have more energy than you actually needed, but you have a 50% chance of ending up with nothing, which still leaves you at 7, which means that you will be dead the next day. So having just this 1 more unit of food, 1 more unit of energy, shifts the decision so that you will be risk averse and play it safe in this less variable environment. So condition matters. Is that relatively understandable? So if you look at this from the standpoint of this idea of kind of building up body condition, building up body stores, and oftentimes the way we quantify body condition is we will take the linear measurement of an organism from either short versus long or tall. So how big are you in terms of your linear measurement, and look at how that varies with body mass. What you generally find is the longer or taller an individual is, the more they weigh, so that there's usually a linear relationship between the length or height of an organism and its mass. But within this linear relationship, you can see that at a given height or length, there are some individuals that are relatively light, and there are some individuals that are relatively heavy. This distance between the line and the data point is the residual. In this case, it would be a negative residual, and in this case, it would be a positive residual. It's negative because it's below the line. It's positive because it's above the line. And so what you can do is you can do this correlation between the linear dimension of an organism and its body mass, look at the residuals that essentially remove the effect of the linear measurement from the measure of body mass, and the value of these residuals become your measurement of body condition. And so when you think about how much weight you carry around, some of that weight, is this thing in your way? This thing is in your way. I will move it back. So when you think about the amount of weight you're carrying around, some of that weight is due to muscle, bone, water, for example, but some of that energy is stored in fat. The nice thing about fat is you can burn up fat relatively quickly and easily to get more energy. And so what we oftentimes see is we see organisms that are storing body condition, store that body condition up in fat. So now is this actually, yeah, that's fine. And so if you take an organism and you look at their morning weight, so this is a bird, great tits from England once again. If you take a bird and look at its morning weight, you're looking at essentially how much energy that animal has burned off overnight. Animals with relatively low morning weight have gone to bed the night before without a huge amount of stores, probably because they know that the next morning they're going to get up, they're going to go forage, and they're going to have enough energy to get by. But if you take these individuals and put them in a variable environment, one of the things that you see happening is after a little bit of time in that variable environment, they start putting on more body fat. They start trying to store more body fat at the end of the day, which means that they weigh more the next morning when they wake up because it's a variable environment and they don't know if they're going to be able to get the food that they need the next day. And as soon as you shift them back into a constant environment, you see that the body mass goes down that they end up with the next morning because, once again, they adjust to the variability of the environment. If you know that you can reliably get food the next day, you're less worried about storing up energy overnight. And so animals can respond to this. Similar thing happens with birds that store food. There are plenty of birds that will go out and forage. They'll bring food back to a place and they'll bury it in a hole in the ground. They'll put it in a cavity in a tree. And when we look at storage, we also see that if you're in a low variability environment versus a high variability environment, you actually see differences in the patterns of food storage. So if you're in a highly variable environment, you're more likely to collect the food that you need, eat that, but then spend time foraging for more food that you just put in storage. Because, once again, you don't know what's going to happen in the environment, so you have these stores to fall back on. What you generally find with this stored food is that regardless of the environment, birds start out the day at low body mass. They spend the day increasing their body mass in preparation for going through this overnight period when they are going to still be using energy, but they're not going to be replacing that energy with any food. So both of these strategies, building up fat stores, storing energy, are all focused on this idea that you need to have a certain body mass in order to make it through the night. And so you see these birds increasing in weight throughout the day. So if you live in a constant environment, you can be relatively risk averse. If you live in a variable environment, you need to be risk prone more often, and you need to take measures that will ensure that you can buffer the variability that is in your environment. So, and I've already introduced the idea of risk prone and risk averse. Would you guys be able to describe kind of what risk prone and risk averse is, if pressed?
I hope so.
Okay. Can you think of a situation in human life where our behavior might differ depending on our condition? Okay, talk to me about that, socioeconomic status.
Well, you mentioned stocks earlier. Obviously, we're going to take the risk or not, but
I mentioned what?
the stocks.
Oh, stocks, like the stock market.
The economic status doesn't really have the capability to take on risk that.
Okay, so the stock market is a risky proposition. You buy a stock, the stock might go up, the stock might go down. If it goes up, you benefit if you sell it when it goes up. And if it goes down, you lose the value of that stock. But if you have a buffer, you can weather that loss. And so if you have, in this case, more body condition, if you want to think of wealth as being kind of analogous to body condition, you might take more risks because losing some money isn't going to sink you. Any other examples? So keep in mind how risk averse and risk prone may change depending on the type of organism and the type of currency that you're talking about. In a similar way, if you want to think of risk prone and risk averse, if you live in a low income neighborhood, you grew up poor, you live in the projects, et cetera, you have a variety of ways in which you can make money as you grow up. You enter your teen years, you get to high school and beyond high school. You have a variety of career paths that you can take. What are some of those career paths? Probably can't go to college because you come from poverty. You don't have enough money to go to college. You had terrible high schools, so you don't have great grades, so you can't get scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. So what are your options?
Like a local store.
You work at like a local store. Go down and work at your local convenience store or something like that. You going to make a ton of money there? No, but it's going to be steady. You're going to get a steady supply of not very much money. What are some other options you have? Hmm?
Trade. Like trade work.
Trade work, once again, depending on the trade, possibly not very much money, but the money's going to be steady. You have to get somebody to apprentice you because learning a trade takes time, oftentimes. Other options. You're avoiding the obvious option. Join a gang. Get into the drug business.
Make a lot of money.
You have the potential to make a lot of money, but that is risk-prone behavior. So once again, depending on the currency and the specifics of the situation, different individuals at different distances away from the margin may behave differently because of the specifics of the situation. I do woodworking, and when you do woodworking, you interact with power tools a lot. Table saws, routers, et cetera, et cetera. I was making a pillbox with a sliding lid, a sliding dovetail lid. And to make the pillbox with sliding dovetail lid, you have to take a little piece of wood actually and run it across a router. And when I was running it across the router, I was pushing the wood up against the fence to hold it in place and pushing it across. And the router, the spinning router blade, a router is a little machine. It's cylindrical. It has a little sharp blade sticking up out of it that spins around like 6,000 RPMs per minute. And you're pushing the wood through, and the router blade will sometimes grab the wood and it'll shoot the wood out of the router. Pew! Shoot it across the shop. And if you're holding onto the wood with your finger, you risk when the wood goes away shoving your hand into the spinning router blade, which I did. With this finger, you can still see it has a crack in the fingernail that's never going to heal because the nail bed is split. And I stuck my hand into the router blade. It caught it, mangled up the tip of my finger. I pulled it out like in a teensy-weensy fraction of a second, but the damage was done. It hurt. Man, it hurt. I'm alone at my house. My wife's at her job. I'm doing this alone. It's not wise working around power tools while nobody else is at the house. I bandaged up my hand as best as I can. I need to go to the hospital because this is probably going to take maybe surgery, who knows what. At least sutures is what's going to happen. So I'm in the car and I'm driving to the emergency room by myself, and I'm being normal in the car because it's bad for my finger, but I'm not going to bleed out. I'm not going to die. I feel like an idiot, but otherwise, everything's fine. My behavior might be different if I had been sawing on the table saw and cut my hand off. Because if I cut my hand off, now I have all these arteries that are exposed. I risk bleeding out. I'm probably not going to be calmly driving to the emergency room. I'm going to be going to the emergency room like a bat out of hell. I'm going to be taking lots of risks of hitting other cars, being hit by other cars, et cetera, because I need to get to the hospital now. Risk prone versus risk averse. My condition determines what my outcome, what my behavior is going to be. because I'm making condition-dependent decisions. Once again, try and relate these things to commonplace situations, and it will help you remember the concept. So, cognition. Clearly, you can't make a condition-dependent decision if you don't have the cognitive ability to know what your own condition is, and if you don't have the cognitive ability to assess whether or not your environment is risky, variable, or constant, and what the exact nature of that variability or constancy is. So cognition factors into decision making because decision making requires information. And so, in theory, the best information you have, the better the decision that you're capable of making. And if you have good information but can't think about that information very well, then you're not really doing anything other than making random choices. So, as it turns out, lots of organisms hoard food. So they will store food so that they have food for when times go bad. We see that in squirrels here on campus. You see squirrels running around in the fall, gathering up acorns, burying them in holes in the ground, because they know that while they're eating all sorts of food right now, when winter sets in and trees are no longer producing food, they're going to be hurting for food, and they're going to want to go back to those stores and find that food, dig that food up, and eat it. Now, the trick to a squirrel digging a hole, putting an acorn in the hole, is, of course, what? Finding the hole again. So how do organisms remember where they've stored their food is a challenge. And so one of the things that we find with animals that hoard food is they usually have really good spatial memory. And so birds and rodents and things like this have excellent spatial memory that is key to a particular location, and they use all kinds of location cues to tell them where the food is that they have stored. And so in general, these animals have good spatial memory. Now, we normally think of memory as being stored in the brain. So you guys have memory. You guys will have to remember all of this information when it comes time for the test. How do you guys remember stuff for a test? You write it down. What else do you do? You make a study guide, and then you use that study guide to do what? You make questions. You practice what we call retrieval practice, forcing your brain to retrieve the information actually gets it more firmly socked in your memory. It's a really good way to study, actually. But you're revisiting the material over and over again because the more times you get exposed to it, the more likely it is to stay lodged in your memory. So the memory is located in the brain. So how can a behaviorist measure what is in the brain of an animal? So you can't walk up to a nuthatch and ask the nuthatch how it remembers things. So how can behaviorists get at the mental machinations of a nuthatch? Well, observation is tricky because you don't know why the animal is behaving the way it is. Is it because of something going on in its brain, or is it something else happening with the animal? In our head, we have a brain, and we have two eyes. This would be the right eye. This would be the left eye. You guys take an anatomy class yet? Anybody? Anyone? What do you know about how eyes are connected to the brain? Go ahead and say it. Yeah, the nerve, the optic nerve coming from the back of the eye, goes to the brain and crosses underneath the brain, and the one from here comes and crosses here, so that the innervation of the nerves from the optic nerve in the right eye actually innervate into the left visual cortex, and the left eye signals go to the right visual cortex. The cool thing about this is that you can then look at what the brain is storing in terms of information by basically covering the left eye with a cover, giving an animal a memory task, and then either asking it to go and find, so ask it, for example, to store food. So cover the eye, store food, then ask the animal to retrieve the food. But for some individuals, let them retrieve the food with the eye that they stored the food memory with. And for other organisms, other individuals, cover the eye that they used to store those memories and make them retrieve the information with the eye that was covered earlier. And some people did exactly this. And they did it, if I'm recalling correctly, with nuthatches. And so what they did was they gave them an environment to store food in. They allowed them to hoard. When they did the hoarding, they covered the left eye. And then when they asked them to go and recover it, they left the left eye covered so that they were recovering the food with the same eye that they were storing the food with. In another set of birds, they covered the left eye while they were hoarding the food, and then they switched the cover to the other eye during retrieval. And what they found was when they looked at the amount of time that it took them to retrieve the food, or the number of visits that it took to the environment to retrieve the food, it turns out that, let me get this right, the pale blue eye, the percentage, so this is the percentage, well, let's see. So it's the percentage of time that they made it to the right tray. So this is a tray filled with moss and food is stored in it. And so this is the percentage of the time that they went to the correct tray where they stored it as when they recover it. And what they found is that when you look for things with the same eye that you hoarded food with, you have a higher percentage of the time you find it, and you find it more often in the number of visits that you look at. When you switch the eye, the percentage of the times that you find it and the number of visits that you find it on goes down. Therefore, this is actually a mental task, and the reason that they can determine this is because right eye material, right eye memories are stored in the left part of the brain. Left eye material and memories is stored in the right part of the brain. And so you have this experiment that demonstrates, yes, this is memory stored in brain. It's not picking up visual cues or olfactory cues or anything else, because of course, if an animal was storing food in this quadrant of the tray, the researchers went and took the food out of the tray before they put the animal back in there to recover the food. So there weren't any cues. There wasn't any food in the tray when they went to do the recovery. So organisms, animals, can remember stuff. Some organisms are better at remembering things than other organisms are. Once again, nuthatches and nutcrackers that just naturally store a lot of food, hoard food, tend to be better at it than animals that don't hoard food. Think about a lion. Do you think a lion has very good spatial memory? Why? Well, they don't hoard food. What do they normally do? Yeah, they find a herd of wildebeest, and then like the herd of wildebeest has thousands of wildebeest in it. It's a really big target. They're not going to run away from you. You can find them if you go to sleep and you wake up the next morning and they're gone. You just climb to the nearest hill and probably see them. Go find them again. Follow them around day to day. Pick off a wildebeest a day, eat it, and you just follow your food around. You don't need to remember where the food was. They probably have not very well developed spatial memory. Do you guys hoard food? not in any complicated way. Where is your food at? It's in the fridge or it's in the pantry. You don't have to think about where your food is. It's in the fridge, it's in the pantry, it's at the McDonald's. That's the places our food is. Any of you ever lose your keys? Do you lose your keys a lot or a little? You don't lose your keys. Why?
Put them in the same spot every day,
You-
or I would lose my key.
Put them in the same spot every day or you would lose your keys. What do you do?
Yeah, I usually keep them in my coat pocket on my desk.
You put them in the same spot every day. I do woodworking. I built a little mail and key holder that's right inside the front door. You walk inside the front door, you can hang your keys on there, you can put your phone in the phone slot, you can put your wallet in the wallet slot. Why? So they're there the next day. So you wake up, it's time to walk out the door, you need your keys, you need your phone, you need your wallet, and they're all there in this nicely organized, well-designed little holder. Because if you walk in and you're in a hurry, and the cat's screaming at you because it wants fed, and you don't do that ritual of putting things on the thing, then you go upstairs and you're getting ready for bed, you discover that your keys and your wallet and everything are in your pockets. And you're like, well, what do I do with them? Well, I put them on the bureau, my chest of drawers. Assuming that I'm in my bedroom when I start to take my pants off, because I might be in the bathroom when I start to take my pants off, in which case they're on the shelf of the bathroom. Unless, of course, I was taking my pants off in the room where my bicycle is because I'm going to do Zwifting, riding on my trainer because it's winter. So I take my pants off in there, just change into cycling shorts, and I put the keys and wallet and phone on the stand where my computer and my iPad sits so that I can do the computer-based bicycle thing. So now, since I didn't put them on the stand, I wake up the next morning and I'm like, where are my keys? And then I have to go around to the usual suspects. Where are they? On the back of the couch? No. In the bathroom on the shelf? No. On my bureau? No. In the side table? No. In the cycling room? There they are. And now I'm 5 minutes late to wherever I was going. Because we don't have particularly good spatial memory. Because we don't hoard food the same way that other organisms hoard food. Losing your keys. Spatial memory. So, cognition is a neural trait. It's based in the brain. Food stores generally have a larger hippocampus. So, we actually know what part of the brain is responsible for saving spatial memory. So, there was this cool study that I read a number of years ago done on London cabbies. Do you guys know anything about the cabbie licensing situation in London? So, cabs in general, before Uber and Lyft, cabs used to be very profitable because you have to get a certification from the city that you're a cabbie in, generally speaking. And so cab tokens in New York City, for example, used to sell for a couple $100,000. If you owned a cab token, as you retired, you could sell that and it would be like selling your house, except that you can sell your cab token and still live in your house. And so they used to be very valuable. And so in many, especially large cities, the process of getting one of those tokens is arduous and complicated. And in London, it's especially complicated because you have to demonstrate your geographic knowledge of the city. So they give you an extensive series of tests to test whether or not you have the geographic knowledge of the city of London in order to get your cab license at the beginning of things. So cabbies in London already start off with probably a better spatial memory than most people. But one of the things that happens is the more you drive a cab around London, the better you get to know the city. And as it turns out, you can look at cabbies versus normal people, and you can look at their hippocampus. And you can take the hippocampus of the brain, and you can divide it into an anterior section, a posterior section, and the body of the hippocampus. And they did this all with MRI studies. And you can basically you can take a cross section of the hippocampus and you can see how much volume the hippocampus is taking up in the brain. And so they measured hippocampus volume, and what they found when they looked at the left hippocampus and the right hippocampus, they found that the anterior portion of the hippocampus was smaller in cabbies and larger in normal people. Let me make sure that I'm getting the things right. Yeah. So, because I know that they had smaller in the anterior and higher in the posterior. The dotted is the cabbies, the dark is the controls. So cabbies have smaller anterior hippocampus, but larger posterior hippocampuses, but the bodies of the hippocampus are not different. So it may be that you only get a cabbies license if you already have a large hippocampus. But what's interesting is over time, for cab drivers, the longer you are a cab driver, the bigger your hippocampus gets. So your brain actually responds to having to acquire and retrieve spatial information by actually growing a bigger hippocampus. So they followed cabbies over time, measured their hippocampus volume at different time periods, and as cabbies got more and more experience, their brains actually increased their capacity by total volume of the ability to store and retrieve spatial memory. And this only happened in the posterior portion of the hippocampus, because in the anterior portion of the hippocampus, it actually got smaller. So not only is spatial memory activated and stored in the hippocampus, it's localized to certain parts of the hippocampus. And as you increase allocation to one part of your hippocampus, you decrease the allocation to the other part of your hippocampus, which is pretty freaky. Cabbies, humans driving cabs. Relatively strong proof that spatial memory is a neural process, a neurally based process, and it's based in a particular part of the brain. Questions? Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It's a pretty cool paper if you ever want to pick it up. The citation is there. What is the difference between episodic memory and procedural memory? If you get clunked on the head, and you lose your memory, you're not a total blank slate, are you? You should know this from any romantic comedy where somebody gets struck on the head and loses their memory of their loved one, and then their loved one spends the whole time trying to make the other person remember who they are and what they had together, et cetera, et cetera. But that person who got clunked on the head, what all kinds of things can you do when you lose your memory? You can still walk. You can still do what else? You can still eat. You can still talk. Oftentimes, you can still drive a car. These kinds of things that are things that we do are what we call procedural memories. They are memories of things that we do. They can often write. They remember how to write. They might not remember what their name is, but if you ask them to sign a piece of paper, oftentimes they will write their name down. They remember writing the signature even though they don't remember the name. What's your name? I don't know. I can't remember. Can you sign this piece of paper for me? Why? Because we've signed our name a gajillion times. When you sign your name, are you thinking Paul Klawinski? Well, no, of course not. You're thinking Mason Alexander. Are you thinking that way? Sounding out each word in your mind as you go? No. It's a rote physical memory. It's a procedural memory. What then is an episodic memory? Specific things that have happened. The day that you get your first job, you might have had to sign a contract. You can still sign your signature. You can still write your signature, but you can't remember that particular signing of a piece of paper. You can drive a car, but if we take you to a parking lot, you can't remember which car is yours. But if we give you the keys and put you in a car, you can turn the key on, you can drive it. The difference between procedural and episodic memory. Procedural memory is not as important in thinking about animals doing behavior, because a lot of the behaviors that animals do are procedural in that an animal will make a particular display, they will forage. If the fact of eating a seed is a procedural thing, you can remember how to eat a seed, as opposed to the episodic memory of remembering where you put that seed that you want to eat. If you can find the seed, you know how to eat it. The trick is remembering where you put the seed. So these two different types of memories have different levels of importance from the perspective of thinking about cognition. Procedural memory isn't as much about cognition as it is about habit. Episodic memory is more about cognition. So in this case, the people who wanted to think about this idea looked at scrub jays. Scrub jays are commonly used in behavioral work. I'm now losing track of time. Do you guys remember Joanna Alpert? She might have been before you guys came on. She was a student. She studied scrub jays in Florida. She looked at their tendency to approach strange objects. She looked at what they call neophilia versus neophobia. She used these same kind of plastic cues in her environment. They put these plastic cues, these plastic blocks up so that the bird has a visual reference to know where they're putting food in these ice trays. So these are just common ice trays. And what they did was they allowed the jays to store food items, but they controlled when the birds had access to the food items. And in one set of experiments, they gave them nuts to store at the beginning of the experiment, and they gave them worms to store 120 hours later. And then 4 hours after that, they sent the birds to the arena to retrieve the items that were stored. In another example, they stored worms first, and then stored nuts, and then 4 hours later, they sent them to retrieve those items. And they did this the same way they did it with the nut hatches before. They allowed the animals to store those items in these trays, but then in between when they stored the nuts and when they retrieved them, they took all the food out. But they remembered, they marked on their data sheets where the birds initially stored these things within these trays. So the birds have physical markers that allow them to distinguish where in the tray you might have put things. But what matters for a bird is worms go bad, nuts don't. So after a time period, the worm slowly decomposes and rots and is not suitable for food. The nut, on the other hand, is still good. So what would you expect these birds to do? Look at experiment 1. Store nuts first, then worms, and then 4 hours later they retrieve them. Worms go bad at about 120 hours or so. Store nuts, store worms. 4 hours later, you come back to eat. What are you going to eat? You might eat nuts, but worms are actually better in a lot of ways. They're more protein, probably more fat, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out, if you have a bird that stores nuts and then worms and then comes back relatively soon after the worms are stored, they come back and they tend to eat the worms first. In the case when you store worms at the beginning and then store nuts and then they come back shortly after that, what do you expect the birds to do? They eat the nuts because they know that the worms are bad. They remember back 124 hours ago. How many hours is 124 hours? 24 hours in a day. So 4 days is 96. 5 days would be, what's 96 and 24? Yeah, they remember 5 days later. 5 days later, I put some worms there. I'm not going to eat those worms. Elizabeth, my wife, wanted a key lime pie last night. We went to the Hy-Vee to get a frozen key lime pie out of the freezer section. They didn't have any key lime pie. So we went over to the bakery. They had a key lime pie there, but we've never bought a key lime pie from the bakery. So I was like, well, do you want to chance it or you just want to do something else for dessert? She's like, no, let's just chance it. We'll give it a chance. Go home, we eat dinner, we break open the key lime pie, we cut ourselves each a slice, and we get into it, and the graham cracker crust is burnt on the bottom. So it's bitter. It's bitter, and as soon as you get that bitter, burnt sugar taste in your mouth, it's just really hard to get it out. So I said, well, let's do a palate cleansing by eating some turtles. You guys know what a turtle is? Chocolate, pecans, caramel. What's that?
I said it wasn't the person that fucked.
Chocolate turtles, no, not like turtle soup or anything. Like, let's have a couple of turtles because we have turtles in the cookie jar. Let's have a couple of turtles to get that bad taste out of our mouth. But I like to have a glass of milk with the turtles. Go into the refrigerator, I get out the carton of milk, I pour myself a glass, I look at it, and it isn't quite homogeneous like you would expect milk to do. I take a sniff, I'm like, it doesn't smell bad. I take a little bit of sip, I'm like, look at the carton. February 11th is the date on it. February 11th is today. This happened last night. Had I had the episodic memory of remembering how many days ago I bought that carton of milk, I might have not even taken it out of the refrigerator. But of course, it had been in the refrigerator long enough, and I've been drinking it with my cereal and stuff in the morning, that I hadn't noticed the amount of time that had passed. And at some point, it crossed over from being good milk to being bad milk. And it did that sometime yesterday. So, over 5 days later, these birds still remember not only 5 days ago I stored worms, but it also remembers where they stored the worms, and they don't go looking for worms in those patches. They remember where they store nuts, and they go looking for nuts in those patches. Episodic memory. So I ate my turtles without milk. And I got the bad taste of the terrible key lime pie out of my mouth. And I got the bad taste of a tiny little bit of spoiled milk out of my mouth. Questions about episodic versus procedural memory? If organisms are going to make decisions that are economic decisions, they have to have good memory, they have to have good cognition, they have to be capable of storing all of those memories about all of the places that they regularly go in their environment. And so it's easy enough to see that An animal that responds to its environment in sensible ways actually has to be pretty good at processing information. It's not a simple task. We think of processing information as a relatively simple task because we do it every day. But we don't oftentimes think about it, how complex the tasks are that we're remembering, that we're accomplishing. In the same way, a bird isn't thinking to itself, I've come to this tray 120 hours ago, or 124 hours ago, I put worms here, here, and here, and here. How do I know that? Well, because the red plastic is here, the blue and yellow plastic is here, and the red and green plastic is here. And I know from where those things are located that my worms are here, 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 and here. My nuts are here, 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 and here. They're not thinking through it this way. Oh, it's been 120 hours. I'm going to avoid the O's. I'm going to feed in the X's. And I remember the X's because I have these visual cues that help me remember the X's. What does a bird do? Walks up to the tray, remembers in this what we would refer to as a kind of emergent property of having a brain. You guys know, has anybody ever taught you about emergent properties? Emergent properties are important, partly because they're important to think about cognition. But it's also important from the standpoint of thinking about a lot of things. But it's super important for cognition. Any of you guys ever bake a cake? Chocolate chip cookies? Okay, chocolate chip cookies. What do you put in chocolate chip cookies? Flour? What's that? Brown sugar and refined sugar, right? Brown and white sugar.
I don't really make chocolate chips.
Okay. We make chocolate peanut butter chocolate chips. You replace some of the butter with peanut butter, and you put cocoa in the flour. So the cookie itself is chocolate. There's peanut butter mixed into the dough, and then you have the chocolate chip. The creaminess of the peanut butter lends a different texture to it that's different than the creaminess of the butter. So we always have butter, a couple of eggs. At our house, we put in cocoa, and did I spell cocoa right? Doesn't matter. And ours actually have peanut butter because ours are peanut butter chocolate chip cookies. So we have each of these ingredients. But when you put them all together and throw them in the oven, do you get flour out at the end? Have you ever eaten raw flour? Me neither. I can imagine that it tastes very good. Do you get butter out at the end? Do you get the individual properties of butter and flour and sugar? You don't. You get this amalgam. You put in each of these individual things. Each of these individual things have their individual properties, but when you bring them all together, they end up creating something that is fundamentally different. When we think about memory and cognition, memory and cognition are based where? There's a box in this corner. Based in the brain, right? What's the brain made up of? You guys should know this. This is basic biology. What's the brain made up of? Neurons. What else? But I'm thinking at the cellular level. So you have a bunch of neurons. You have a ton of neurons. What else? If you work with do any of you work with Dr. Bhupinder? No, but you've heard their students talk about brains and nerves and stuff. What other things are in your brain? Cell types. You ever hear of glial cells? Glial cells, there's a variety of cells that are kind of the support cells. They provide nutrition to the neurons. They provide, in some cases, physical support to the neurons, et cetera, et cetera. But those glial cells, in many cases, aren't directly involved in memories and cognition and things like this. Most of the memory and cognition work is done by the neurons themselves. What does an individual neuron do? Has kind of two states, doesn't it? It's an excited state when it's being stimulated, sends an action potential down the length of the neuron, and it has an unexcited state when it's not doing that, right? Neurons, in many ways, are binary. They're either on or they're off. At one level, your brain is just a bunch of on-off switches. Billions and billions of on-off switches, maybe trillions of on-off switches. I don't actually know how many neurons are in your brain, but they're all just on-off switches. It's on or it's off. But somehow, out of that on-off switch, billions and billions of on-off switches, is remembering what episodic memory is remembering what it was like the first time that you rode a bicycle without training wheels. All those on-off switches are the first time you fell in love with somebody. All those on-off switches produce, love that you have for your parents, the memory of the taste of peanut butter chocolate chip cookies. That all comes out of the emergent property of billions of on and off switches. Lots of things that we study in biology have emergent properties. Brains happen to be one of them. And brains are actually one of the most mysterious ones. Vision is the same way. Vision is governed by individual photons of light hitting individual parts of the photoreceptors in your eye. All of those things are connected to individual nerves. Those nerves go to your brain. And somehow, out of each of those individual actions, your brain produces this emergent property, which is vision, by which you can see the board, you can see baseballs coming at your face, so you can get out of the way of them, etc., etc. All of these memory and cognition things that we're talking about are emergent properties of simple neurons, all working in concert with one another. It produces this complex behavior that isn't really explained by the individual action of any given nerve. So think about that as you think about these other things as well. There's so much that we don't understand about the way brains work, but one of the goals of animal behavior is to make some progress along the lines of figuring out how animal brains work. Questions? If you look, risk of predation is next. There's nothing written on this slide because we've read a whole paper, Lima and Dill, that talks about the risk of predation. So what we're going to do at the beginning of class is we're just going to kind of go and revisit the things that they talked about in that paper. Not in as much detail as we talked about them in lab, but just hit the high points. And then we'll move from there into I don't know what the next topic is. Oh, social learning. So how information gets passed from one individual to another, one generation to another, as we continue to talk about information. All right.